But this is one of the more popular frameworks out there. It's being used by academia. We know that different universities, University of Chicago, Pittsburgh, for instance, are using it. The FTC is using it. There are international organizations that are using it. You can think about it in different tiers. You have a tier 1, which is your organization doesn't even understand how well or what its risks are at the IT level. A tier 2, when you're a little bit more risk informed. A tier 3, where you repeatedly try, test, and educate yourself about it and do evaluations. And a tier 4, where you not only do evaluations on a consistent basis, but you do evaluations proactively looking into the future to see what kind of threats are coming in. And so this gives you an integrated risk management program. Usually there are external vendors who participate in it. There are consultants, there are training companies out there that help you do it. But this is an integrated risk management process. And this is something that we see a lot of organizations starting to use. And I'm on the NIST website is a sample application at Intel. And I'm going to just give you an overview of how Intel has applied this to solve one of the critical problems that I'm talking about, the people problems of Intel. So the people problems of risk, Intel applied the NIST framework. And this is straight out of the NIST website. Again, this is available for people to look at quite simply, and I'm not going to go through the entire details here. Intel solved this people problem by saying, by assessing what tier it was at, its staff were at, when they started. And when they started off, they realized that their entire staff, the general employee population, had little to no cybersecurity training. So they went from a tier 1, which is not knowing where the risk was, to a tier 2 by basically training their staff. Then they went from a tier 2 to a tier 3 by assessing their staff one more time and then training them on maybe a different type of education or different type of learning. And then they kept doing that on an adaptive level and checking on a continuous basis. This entire document, right, tells you what Intel did over a course of 6 months to maybe a couple of years in terms of meeting the requirements of what the NIST framework guidelines put out. The short of this entire document, if you want to get a synopsis of it, the key words are basically 2 words: awareness and training. So there's 2 things that happens when you go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 to tier 4. You focus on the level of awareness and you inject training. How is this done? I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So what I'm going to talk about right now is how organizations outside of Intel, because what we never see is the real data and how these organizations are doing it and whether it even works. Because the bigger question here is, yes, we have a framework. Yes, we understand it. But is this appropriate? And does it really work? The first one is a case study where an organization tried to go from a tier 1 to a tier 2. So tier 1 being their staff were completely uninformed about cybersecurity. From that, they tried to go to tier 2, where they were relatively informed about it. The way they did it is through what I call didactic training. What is didactic training? Didactic training is any kind of classroom type training. It's what you used to get when you were in school. So this is the kind of training that's focused. This could be one-on-one. This could be a webinar that you have to sit through. This is a form of didactic training, what we're engaged in right now. It's usually focused. It's usually maybe a day, maybe a few hours. Some of them call it onboarding training. But this is kind of like one form of training that is pretty popular. And if you're a CISO or a CIO listening in, you've probably been a part of this, or you've had some consultants talk to you about this. So we wanted to test to see whether this organization really did manage to go from tier 1 to tier 2, and how effective was this. So the organization was it's a relatively large financial organization with approximately 500 employees. It's a risk management company. So these employees are managing large amounts of capital. And what we did with these guys is we had roughly half of them get trained with this off-the-shelf security awareness training program. And this is a program that took them 2 days to complete, followed by tests and exams and so on and so forth. And 4 weeks later, I conducted a spear phishing test. And the test that I conducted was on 3 non-consecutive days. So basically on a Monday, on a Wednesday, and a Friday, I repeated the same test on all 500 employees. So the idea here was, did we go from level 1 to level 2? This was the attack that we used. I have whited out some parts of this attack just to anonymize the document. And what we found was pretty interesting. The Verizon data breach reports talks about 50% of victims opening emails and clicking on phishing links within the first hour. What we found in our attack was exactly the same thing. Within the first hour, we had 50% of everybody clicking on these links and opening them. More importantly, it didn't matter if you were trained or not. The training had absolutely no effect on whether or not you were going to click and open this link. At the final analysis, about 1 in 3 of everybody we sent the attack to fell for it, and it didn't matter. So in other words, whatever they were doing in didactic training was marginally successful. Because remember, from a phishing attack standpoint, from a ransomware standpoint, from any spear phishing attack standpoint, you just need one victim. We had 34% of 500 that were victims. So we tried now to look at the second way in which organizations go from a tier 1 to a tier 2 to a tier 3 to a tier 4. And this form of training is what is more popular out there, and it's called embedded training. And so what's embedded training? Embedded training is the kind of awareness training that we do through phishing tests. So what happens here is the organization sends you a phishing email, and then every time you fall for the phishing email, you click on a link and fall for that attack, or you click on an attachment, you get some training that tells you what you did wrong. This is an interesting protocol. This is a protocol that is different from the didactic training protocol, but sometimes it's done in conjunction. So first you get some didactic training, then you get a lot of this phishing awareness training through testing, the embedded training. The interesting thing about this kind of attack is the phishing failure itself is seen as a risk metric. So if the number of people who click on the link or the number of people who focus or open the attachment, they're the guys who are at risk. That's your victimization rate. So if you send it to 100 people and 10 people click on it, we say, well, there's a 10% risk in your organization. And the training, which is the embedded training that pops up, that itself is a risk reduction checkbox. So it lets the CISO say, hey, we got this product, it's doing everything, and more importantly, it achieves the NIST risk requirement guidelines. Why? Because it goes from partial to informed, risk informed, to repeatable, because you can keep doing this over and over again throughout the course of a year or maybe 2 years. And also it's adaptive. Why is it adaptive? Because you can keep changing the kind of attacks that you're testing. So this has been adopted by organizations essentially everywhere, pretty much in most parts of the world now, as the standard for risk assessment as well as mitigation. So what organizations do with this data is very often they find the people who are doing this, who are falling for these attacks. They give them more didactic training, or sometimes they blame them, they shame them, they scare them. There's a lot of these other techniques that all the systems out there are starting to use. So the question here was, how well does this framework work from a risk assessment and a risk mitigation standpoint? And this was something we realized there was really no good data out there, because much of the data comes from companies that have a vested interest in the outcome. So this was a second case study. Again, this is data that I personally collected through a study that I did with my research team. And in this particular case, there was an organization, it's a small federal agency, federal government agency in the United States, that had already been doing these kind of phishing tests for a period of over 2 years. So they have been doing this for every month, every quarter rather, they have 3 to 6 different types of phishing attacks that they constantly do, these testing attacks. And they had already collected data on it. This particular agency has about 600 employees across the East and West Coast of the United States. They have a very popular simulation product, each of which does what every other product out there essentially does. And I really like this CISO because this gentleman really, really wanted to solve the problem. He was by the book, and what he was trying to do very clearly was achieve the NIST framework requirements. And I just want to show you real quick the spear phishing internal testing data that they already had with them. And if you can look at this in the first quarter of 2016, they're at 11%, which is when they started. So they're at tier 1 or tier 2, depending on how you want to look at those tiers. But they're very early on at around 10% of their market, of all their employees falling for the phishing attack. And by quarter 3, quarter 4 of 2017, when I was engaged with them, they were down to a 0.045%. So in theory, this looks fantastic because you're close to a NIST tier 4. And the CISO came to me saying, hey, how can I bring this down to 0? I still have one odd person here or there who's clicking on one of these links. How can I bring this down to 0? And so My mandate was to bring this down to 0, but I said, well, in order for me to do this, I've got to create a phishing attack. And this was the attack I created. Again, some parts of it have been, blanked out because I want to maintain the anonymity of the organization. But this was the attack that I created. It's a very simple attack. It just recreates some of their internal documents and nothing too spectacular here. And we sent this attack out. This is the email I got within 25 minutes after I created the attack, after I launched the attack, rather, from the CISO. And I'm just going to read this out real quick because this says it all. He says, I sure have had a busy morning. My administrator and deputy both called me confessing that they clicked on what looks like a bad email, your phishing test. They never fail a test. This looks like it may be our worst test, maybe ever, with about 40 people failing so far, and the West Coast folks are not yet awake. This says it all. By the time we were done with the study, we had a 15% success rate. This was an inexplicable thing. Keep in mind, for 2 years, their internal data showed an incredible reduction. What just happened here? So when you look at both of these, between the two protocols, this protocol definitely appears to be better. But don't forget, this protocol has been in place for almost 36 attempts before we got involved in it. But this completely turned the data on its head because they started off at 10% and they're back to 14% once we started. So what's going on here? First, I want to just real quick talk about some of the mistaken assumptions that underlie some of these kind of protocols that are out there. Every time the individual has an accident, we try to look at them and say, wait a minute, you had an accident, you shouldn't be having this accident, let's train them again. First problem here is we use the accident to think that the accident is a symptom. The accident is not a symptom. An accident is simply an outcome. We don't even know what the symptoms are. In other words, we don't know yet why those 15% of the people were falling for the attack. Was it because they got trained, or was it because it was completely different, something we didn't even think about? So that's the first assumption. And I'm going to show you data that questions and demonstrates why these assumptions are wrong. The second assumption that we make with a lot of these attacks and these kind of protocols that we have in place right now is we think we understand what causes user cyber risk. And I know many CISOs out there who have really tried. Here is someone who emailed me. He's an IT director of a bank, a large bank in the United States, who basically saw my talk and he said, hey, you know what? I've been having a program here for 3.5 years. And I've tried to see if it's, what it is that predicts whether my employees fall for phishing. And this is the most hilarious part. It's not age, it's not gender, it's not position, it's not longevity, it's not role, it's not eye color. Just when I think we're making progress, the complexity of the human bites again. And this is what it is. We still don't know what causes cyber risk. The third, we assume that phishing knowledge is the problem. If you go back to that Intel document, the word awareness and training just go together as if the only problem is awareness or knowledge. In the federal agency that we did our test in, the people who got phished and the people who didn't get phished had exactly the same knowledge levels. So again, this is another assumption that doesn't work. It's an untenable assumption. Let's look at the fourth assumption, that if we just repeat this often enough, we get people to learn, that repetition somehow makes things better. What we don't realize, and this is what happened with this particular data set, repetition makes people, users, smarter because they guess what it is that you're trying to do. Users are busy doing their work. When we ask these people, how would you rate your ability to spot a real phishing email from an internal phishing test? 70% of them said, hey, it's good to excellent. I can tell you when, and we had follow-up answers, which I'm not presenting here, but basically they were able to tell us exactly which ones were phishing tests as against real phishing emails. The fifth assumption, somehow if we just shame people, somehow if we just do some punitive treatment, somehow we believe that improves security consciousness, and it doesn't. In fact, one of the reasons why the data, the internal data, looked as good as it did is because most of these people could either recognize it, which means they were trained to the test, or they were so afraid they were not opening their email. And there's a cost to that we never think about. So our existing assumptions are somewhat completely flawed when it comes to the protocols that we have in place right now. And we know that the protocols really don't work because when you look at real data as against the data that you're generating internally, it's giving us a fake sense or false sense of resilience, which is scarier than knowing the truth is more important than feeling that you're secure within the kind of enterprise structure that we have.